Good day, everyone. So today we're tackling Chapter 8 of Strategic Management, or Session 4.1, Creating and Formulating Strategy. So what are our alternatives? How do we evaluate? And how do we choose our strategies? So just to put things into context, you remember this figure here, which really explains our process of strategic management. And we started out by looking at our current mission and vision. And then we started to look at our external environment using such models as the PESTEL analysis and also the five forces, the Porter's five forces model, to try to analyze our industry and also what are the external factors that are affecting our industry. So that's the top part here. And then later on, we looked at our internal characteristics, our competencies and our capabilities, and our culture, the organization's culture. So these are internal factors, and we used an approach called VRIO to try to find out whether our resources are valuable, rare, inimitable, or in other words, they can be easily or not easily copied. And finally, if we are organized to capitalize or to exploit these resources. So that's the VRIO approach to try to figure out whether we have certain strengths and weaknesses. We also use the 7S model. Again, that's focused on our internal characteristics and trying to, again, determine whether we can use any of these characteristics to exploit our opportunities and our threats. So today, we bring it all together. Right? So we try to figure out, okay, now that we know what our opportunities and threats are, how do we best capitalize on these opportunities? And how do we block these threats, especially competition? So we are at this point now where we're now looking at how do we formulate the strategy based on our SWOT analysis. So really, this is a very important lecture because we're going to bring all things together, all those analysis together to really come up with the main reason why we do this analysis. This is in order for the firm to come up with a relevant strategy. Okay, so here's a slide which shows us different approaches to coming up with our strategy. And we said we looked at our resource-led strategies, which is looking at our competencies and our capabilities. And then we also looked at the external environment, or what we call the market-driven opportunities. And then we looked inside ourselves some more and tried to see how we could innovate in order for us to capitalize on these market-driven strategies. We could also just continue to do the same thing, more or less a status quo type of approach. However, we try to improve the way we are doing things to try to bring down our costs, for example, and our efficiencies. So you can look at those four options, and you can see that you could divide these four options in different ways. We know that if we're just looking at our current capabilities, then we're looking at the left side of this figure, which is at the present perspective. But we can also look at the future and trying to figure out how do we change our organization to better deal with these opportunities. Then we're looking at the future perspective. Okay, so there's different ways of seeing our options. Okay, so as I said before, we must do a SWOT analysis and bring all that analysis we've done in terms of our PESTEL analysis, our five forces, our VRIO, and bring that together in a cohesive analysis called a SWOT analysis. But one other approach that I'd like to introduce to you today is what we call the TOES approach. So it's very, very similar to the SWOT analysis. But all it does is it makes you focus first on the external environment. Look at first the opportunities that are happening out there. Look at the threats to our industry and figure out, after that, figure out what are our strengths that we could use to exploit these opportunities. which is in this quadrant here. And what are our strengths that can block the coming threats within our industry? So for example, competition is a threat. So how do we use our strength to block competition? So that is what we call the ST strategies and also the SO strategies. But then we also need to look at our weaknesses. Now, if we have a weakness and this is making it difficult for us to exploit an opportunity, then what actions can we take to minimize this weakness so that we can use the opportunities that we've identified? So again, a great example would be Dyson. We know that Dyson is thinking about entering the automotive industry via an electric car. That's a great opportunity because the electric car industry is growing by, in some cases, like 60% per year, which is a huge growth. But then we know that Dyson has weaknesses. And among these weaknesses is the fact that they are not in the market right now. They don't have the experience or the current competence to really compete in this highly competitive market. So that is a weakness. And so therefore, Dyson has to figure out how does it counteract this weakness. And we know also that there are threats to the electric vehicle market. There are other substitutes that might come in. For example, hydrogen-powered cars. And this is an example of a type of fuel that basically will not need to have batteries. So all you need to do is put in hydrogen into your car, and it basically will turn this into an electric power which can run your vehicle. So that is a threat to the current electric car industry right now. And what are the weaknesses of Dyson? And how does it prevent them from counteracting this hydrogen-powered threat? So, how can you minimize, in other words, a company's weaknesses to avoid the threats you identified? So again, the TOS approach to me makes a lot more sense because first we're looking at opportunities and threats, the external environment, and we're only looking at the strengths that are relevant to these opportunities and the weaknesses that are relevant to these opportunities and threats as well. So, we could come up with a strengths and weaknesses list. We have so many of these things that can characterize our company. But if none of them are relevant, in other words, they don't make, it doesn't help us any in determining our strategies for opportunities and threats, we should just toss them out. So a good example or application of this is, as you can see here, Volkswagen. So here's a TOS analysis for Volkswagen, the car company. It's a German car company. And we can see that among the opportunities that it is seeing is the affluent market demands more luxurious cars with many options. In other words, the market is turning more affluent. They want better looking, more features. These cars are luxurious cars. So that's an opportunity that Volkswagen needs to sort of capitalize on. There are offers for Volkswagen to create an assembly plant in the United States, because currently they're operating in Europe. And they're looking at perhaps going into the United States, which is the biggest car market in the world, by the way. And then the third is Chrysler, which is a different car manufacturer, and American Motors are looking for small engines. They currently make big engines as a company, and they're wondering whether they can perhaps do an alliance with Volkswagen, because Volkswagen has the technology for small engines and the production capability. So those are the opportunities, and there are certain threats, like for example, the exchange rate threat. The US dollar is devaluating or might devaluate versus the Deutschmark, which is the German currency, because German currency is showing some strength. Of course, included in that is the competition from Japanese and US automakers. And another threat would be the rise in fuel prices. So These are these common threats. By the way, this analysis may have been done maybe 10 years, 5 to 10 years ago, so it may not necessarily be current. But this just gives you an example of what a company might do to identify its opportunities and threats. And then again, with the TOS approach, we look at first our strengths and our weaknesses. And one example of a weakness of Volkswagen is the heavy reliance on one product. And one product might be the Volkswagen Golf, which is a very successful model for Germany, for Volkswagen. They have a huge market share in that small car market or mid-sized market. But really, everything else in terms of the other brands and the other products they have, they're not quite as successful as the Golf brand. There's also rising costs in Germany, partly because, again, the Deutsche Mark may have been increasing in value in that time of that period. And if they go into the United States, the problem is they have no experience dealing with labor unions. Just one example here is Mercedes-Benz, once upon a time, purchased Chrysler, the American car company. And so basically a German company operating in the United States. And that was actually a big disaster. It did not do well at all. And eventually they split up. So the Mercedes-Benz had to sell Chrysler again because they basically could not properly operate the Chrysler company. So again, that's a weakness of Volkswagen. And looking at the opportunities for Volkswagen and the car industry, here are the strategies or the opportunities and weakness strategies of Volkswagen. So Volkswagen can develop compatible models for different price levels using the same chassis. So an example of this is the Volkswagen Touareg, which is a mid-level SUV. So it's a 4x4 car, and the chassis, the main frame they're using for that, they have actually used that for the Porsche Cayenne, which is Porsche is a company that is owned by Volkswagen, but here they are using some efficiencies by sharing the same chassis. Okay, and that way they can bring down the cost of development. And basically, again, economies of scale. By making the same chassis, they can bring down the costs. Second strategy here is to build a US plant to cope with the rising costs in Germany. So if you have a plant in the United States, you can actually keep some of that money within the United States. And when there is a devaluation of the United States dollar, or an increase in the Deutsche Mark, you can play with your exchange rate. That way you can basically move money around depending on which currency is more valuable. Obviously, if the US currency is more valuable, then you keep your money within the United States. If the Deutsche Mark becomes more valuable, then you operate more in Germany, and you convert your money into German marks at an early period. So that's one way to deal with that exchange rate fluctuation. You can hire US managers to deal with the union. So in other words, if you don't have experience dealing with the unions, then you could instead hire people who have the expertise to deal with the labor unions. So that's just an example of how we can address our weaknesses so that we can better exploit our opportunities. So the same thing with strengths. We can develop and produce a multi-product line with many options, especially for premium brands. So that a strategy that uses the strength of Volkswagen's R&D and engineering. They can build an efficient US assembly plant, which basically makes sense, uses the strength of Volkswagen in sales and its service network within the United States, because it has dealerships within the United States. And it can build and sell engines to Chrysler and American Motors. again, increasing their economies of scale and using their expertise in automated factories in creating or producing cars. So, we can go on. I didn't, you can go and look at each of these quadrants. But again, the whole point I'm making is that first you look at your opportunities and threats and see how you can use your strengths to capitalize on the opportunities. How can you use your strengths to block threats? What weaknesses should you improve on in order for you to capitalize on an opportunity and then mitigate or reduce a threat? So we're looking at, again, first looking at external and then looking at the internal. All right, so looking at our strategic alternatives, after you've done your TOS analysis, then you can look at the different alternatives which will make sense based on our TOS analysis. So you have basically three basic alternatives or general categories of alternatives. The first is what we call, I'll start from the bottom here, retrenchment. So this is when your company is really on the pathway to bankruptcy perhaps, and it's doing really poorly. So you need a strategy that will turn around the company and perhaps even sell parts of the company to survive. So that's a retrenchment strategy. And then going back to the very top here, another alternative is, let's say you're doing quite well, and what you're trying to do is basically just continue on the growth of the company. You might look at limited growth strategies, and among them, these are market penetration, market development, and product development strategies. We'll take this up even more next week when we talk about the Ansoff growth matrix, but this is quite related to that. And we'll give examples of that in a moment. The other category would be substantive growth. So substantive growth means that these are high risk but high reward strategies. These are the strategies that will cost you billions of dollars to do, but we're hoping that it's something that will bear fruit, in 5 to 10 years. So an example of that might be the most risky, I think, here is what we call unrelated diversification, where we are buying or going into a completely new market that we know nothing about, but because the industry is growing very quickly, we're willing to take that risk. So an example would be Dyson. Dyson is a known brand of appliances, vacuum cleaners, hair dryers, etc. They're very good at design, but they're thinking of entering a market that actually they've never been in, and it's quite unrelated if you think about it, the electric car industry. So that's high risks for them. There's going to have to spend a lot of money to try to establish, first of all, the research and development in that area. But the other thing that they need to think about is how are they going to be selling, if they've developed a car, how do they produce it? And then how do they distribute it around the world? So that's quite risky for them. So vertical integration is less risky because what you're doing there is you're still operating within the industry, but you're still within that industry, but you are going either upwards or downwards, or forward or backward integration. So an example of that is when Lenovo, this computer company, it used to be a supplier of parts to IBM. So IBM was a computer manufacturer, and they made ThinkPad, a laptop. So IBM was doing that. And Lenovo came in as first a supplier, then eventually it became a manufacturer of laptops for IBM. IBM used to hire them to make their laptops. Then eventually Lenovo forward integrated and actually purchased the brand ThinkPad from IBM. IBM divested from its laptop making business because it felt that that industry was very cutthroat, very price oriented, and basically they couldn't really compete in that market. So therefore they backed out of that and focused on services. And Lenovo stepped in and purchased their ThinkPad brand. And now Lenovo sells its brand of laptops around the world. And that's an example of, from being a supplier, they became a branded manufacturer and marketer of laptops. So you can argue that that is a form of related diversification. So from the supply of computer parts and into the actual making of a branded laptop, is still within the industry, and therefore that's related. Horizontal integration is when you're actually purchasing a competitor. So you might be operating in that same industry, like for example, Hewlett-Packard was competing with Compaq, another brand of computers, and HP bought Compaq, and therefore that's a form of horizontal integration. Looking at my little list here of examples. So an example of product development is when you have a new product, but still within the same market. So you're come up with a new product that you can sell to the existing market that you are familiar with. These customers basically know your brand, but they basically are offering them a completely new product. So Gillette, for example, is a market leader in blades for shaving, and many years ago they decided to create a new product, a shaving cream that could help you shave. So that's basically an example of a new product, still talking to the same target market. Another example would be Uber. So Uber, as you know, started out as a ride-share company where you basically have an application which enables you to call a vehicle like a taxi to bring you around. But then they innovated by coming out with Uber Eats. So that's a different product, but they're actually first marketing it to their existing customers. And these are the same people that call them for their rideshare would now be calling them for food delivery. So again, that's an example of product development. So market development, an example of that would be aspirin. So you might not understand what aspirin is. Aspirin is for many years, in fact, it's probably been around for 100 years or so. And that's originally a medicine for a headache. So you take it to basically relieve your headache. But they found out that it has certain other benefits, and it thins the blood. So basically, it's a good drug for prevention of heart disease. So many people take just a little bit of aspirin every day if they have a heart condition. So again, a same product, but a different use. So that's an example of market development. Market penetration is simply you have a company who's trying to expand its market share using the same product. So same product and same market. So if a Woolworths, for example, comes out with a promotion selling these little things, not selling, but actually giving them away. So if you purchase $30 worth of grocery items, then they give you a little domino brick here. It's a collectible brick with a Toy Story figure. And you basically, wow, that's really cute. And in order for you to collect the entire series, you need to go back into the grocery to buy more items. So what happens is it diverts you away from its competitors and makes you focus on buying your groceries from only Woolworths. So that is an example of market penetration. So again, depending on the situation of your company, you might use a limited growth set of strategies, substantive growth set of strategies, or even a retrenchment strategy, depending on, again, your situation. So growth strategies, can come from organic growth. So you're not necessarily getting, you're not necessarily buying or acquiring a new company. You're simply using the same set of products that you have or making new products within your company. That's what we call organic growth. Another might be to acquire or take over other firms, like for example, HP purchasing Compaq. Another might be you don't necessarily purchase a company, but you have an agreement with them that you will work together. So an example of a strategic alliance is might be Dyson. So we know that Dyson wants to get into the electric car industry. However, they don't have any production facility for cars or any distribution facility for cars. But they've got the research and development. So they might strike a strategic alliance with an existing car company where Dyson provides the research and development on their batteries, but then the car manufacturer will help them make the car and also distribute or sell the car. So you could have an alliance where you share the branding, Dyson BMW perhaps, or Dyson Mercedes-Benz, or what have you. This is of course hypothetical. It's not happening yet, but you never know. That is an example of a strategic alliance that you can do. So for every vehicle that you sell, you probably will be able to share the profits between Dyson and whatever car company they do an agreement with. So another approach, which is similar to a strategic alliance, is what we call a joint venture. So the difference in between strategic alliance and joint venture is in a joint venture, you're actually establishing an independent company who is jointly owned by the organizations that started. So an example again would be Dyson, bringing their strategic alliance into a third party. So let's say the Dyson BMW company, and start producing electric cars. They say that is it's like a marriage. Strategic alliance might be a mutual agreement, but a joint venture is really more like you've actually gotten married and you're now working together. Another example of this would be Sony teaming up with Ericsson to create the Sony Ericsson brand of mobile phones. This was many years ago. And Ericsson had the technology. Sony also had some capabilities in miniaturizing certain electronics. So they got together to form Sony Ericsson, which ran for a couple of years. But eventually, Ericsson sold its share to Sony, and now it is simply called Sony for mobile phones. Okay, now let's watch this video now from on Moodle. It's about China's Haier, which is an appliance company. They make refrigerators, air conditioning, perhaps ovens and kitchen appliances, etc. And they started with very humble beginnings in China, and they grew and grew. And you can see from the strategies later that they've come up with that they're using varied growth strategies. So you could have limited and substantive growth strategies that Haier is using. So I want you to watch this video on your own. And then after you watch it, try to figure out whether Haier is using organic growth. Are they acquiring companies? Are they doing strategic alliances? Are they creating joint ventures? And you can see if they're doing some integration, vertical integration or diversification for that for their company. So pause this video and then watch the other one, and then we can have a discussion on Haier. Okay, we are back. And after viewing that video, I'm sure you would have realized that Haier has actually done an acquisition. At the end of the video, you can see that they actually purchased one of the businesses of GE, General Electric, which is actually earth-shaking because they used to be competitors, and instead they purchased one of the businesses of GE. I want to sort of stress that they didn't purchase the entire GE. What they did was they looked at the appliance business of GE and purchased only that particular business. So that is considered an acquisition. Okay, so let's go on. All right, so after we've developed different alternatives of strategies, now we figure out, okay, which of these alternatives are we going to choose? So some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves is, what constitutes a good strategic choice? So how do we know whether a strategy is in fact the right strategy or not? What can an organization do and what can it not do? So in other words, there are certain things we want to do, but do we have the expertise to do it? Now, Dyson really wants him to go into the electric car industry, and they're very good. They have certain capabilities, but are these capabilities enough to enter such a complex and a very different type of industry? Thirdly, what should the organization seek to do, and what should it not seek to do? So in other words, maybe some of these things are not really desirable. It might be a trap. You might want to go into an industry that looks so attractive, but in actuality, it's really not attractive. Again, an example might be the airline industry. And we've said before that although it looks exciting, airplanes, and we can see the millions of dollars that passengers have to pay, for this industry, within this industry. But we realize after Michael Porter has actually done a proper analysis, we can see that it's actually not that substantial in terms of the returns that it gives you, and the risks involved are tremendous. So the risk, the high amount of risk and the low amount of revenue or returns will tell you that it's not really something you should seek to do. Especially now in COVID-19, most airlines are teetering on the brink of bankruptcy because of the sudden shutdown of travel around the world. So, in other words, of course, it's a very busy slide, but I urge you to just focus on these three things, these three circles, which tells us the first question we ask ourselves is it an appropriate strategy? Is this something that we have the capability to do based on our SWOT analysis, as we said? Is there an EVR congruence? So in other words, the values that we have, the resources that we have, do they in fact fit into the environment or the opportunity? Is our culture the right culture to enter this industry? Second question is it feasible? So yes, it might be appropriate. We might have all the right skills and competencies and capabilities, but can we in fact convert these capabilities into this new industry that we want to go into? Or is it something that's maybe impossible? Third question is desirability. Does it actually give us the appropriate return on our investment, in other words? So this is really more the financial perspective coming into play. And as I said, it might be appropriate for Boeing, the aircraft manufacturer. It might be appropriate for them to go into the airline industry. In other words, not only do they make the planes, but they also operate the planes. So that is appropriate for them because they have the skills to do it. They make airplanes already. Feasible? Yes, they could in fact purchase an airline if they wanted to. But is it desirable? Maybe not, because the risks involved are too much. The returns aren't really that big, and they in fact may be hit by this COVID-19 crisis, for example, and basically the returns just aren't there. So again, it might be appropriate, it might be feasible, but if it might not be desirable, or might be desirable, might be appropriate, but it's not feasible, meaning you don't have the right resources to be able to go into this different industry. So again, these are the three big questions we need to ask ourselves. Let's have a look at this video here on Theranos. So Theranos is a pharmaceutical company, or was a pharmaceutical company. And it gave, it was a big controversy because it became a billion-dollar company. They were able to raise more than $1 billion in investment money with this novel idea that they had. So I want you to sort of pause this video and watch this video on Moodle, and then ask yourself, did the Theranos strategy, was it feasible, was it desirable, or was it appropriate? Okay, so have a look at, and ask yourself those questions while you're watching it, then take notes, and then we'll come back and discuss this at a later time. Okay, we are back after watching that video. As you can see, really interesting story. By the way, right now Theranos is nowhere to be found. They're basically a zero value company. And the Elizabeth Holmes, the founder, is in trouble, and she's being sued, and has a there's a chance that she might land in jail, actually, because of the lies that she had to do, when she was offering this wonderful idea about diagnosing with a drop of, just a small drop of blood, being able to diagnose different illnesses. And we can ask ourselves, really, was it an appropriate, feasible, and desirable strategy? I can say it's very desirable, right? We know that everybody wants this idea. It's a wonderful idea, just having that much drop of blood, and you can actually have a range of illnesses being diagnosed. That's really something like a holy grail that people are really after. Is it an appropriate strategy? Definitely. In fact, Theranos, is hiring top-level scientists to be able to try to develop this idea further. It was really a good mission. Had the resources capable. They raised $1 billion to do it. But the third question, was it feasible? So was it in fact physically possible to create this machine? And apparently it was not. All right, so the reason why she was able to raise so much money in investment was because she convinced people. She was a very persuasive person. She convinced people that it was an appropriate strategy. It was very desirable. Again, but unfortunately, she failed in that feasibility. And a lot of people didn't see that. All they saw was that it was such a wonderful idea, but they forgot to look at the details of that strategy. Okay, so this slide just tells us how do we make decisions and how do we solve problems. And basically, there are 4 approaches to that. So let's look at each one of these approaches to problem solving very carefully. In your slides, by the way, you might have noticed that I do put in some notes right under that, and you can actually go into it when you're doing your review and see if I've got a more detailed explanation of this slide. So when you're approaching it on you're trying to solve a problem, a solution is the optimum answer. So in other words, this is when you actually find a solution to the problem that completely addresses all the aspects of the problem, and you're able to solve it. There's something like what we're doing with COVID-19, and what we're saying is that the vaccine is a way to solve this problem completely. But then, there's some people are saying that it may not actually be the end all. So even if you do have a vaccine, it may not necessarily solve the complete problem. Part of that reason is because even if you take the vaccine, your antibodies might develop after six months, but you may need a second vaccine shot as a booster when these antibodies start to go down after a year or so. But anyway, solving is coming up with a solution to this problem. Another approach is, if you can't find the optimum solution, is to find a second best solution, which is an example of resolving. So all of these measures that we're doing right now to try to reduce the contact between people, trying to have social distancing, these are examples of resolutions or resolving the problem with some measures that may not completely solve it, but it does address some of these the symptoms. So we're trying to reduce the number of COVID-19 cases by doing these acts. So another approach is dissolving, which as explained here, is when you change your viewpoint of the problem and we say, well, it cannot be solved, so let's do something else. Another example of dissolving, in the case of Theranos, we know that what she was trying to do was come up with one small machine which could basically diagnose different illnesses from one drop of blood. So she was trying to come up with a solution, but she was unable to. Dissolving approach might be, why not come up with this, something similar, like not just have one machine, you might have several machines, and then therefore do the blood test, across many machines. So you may not necessarily have just one drop of blood, but you might have 4 drops of blood for these 4 different machines. So instead of having one machine, you have several machines. It wasn't the original objective of coming up with one machine, but the dissolving approach is at least very close to having just one machine, but having several in fact. So he's trying to dissolve the problem. And the last approach is absolving, which is similar. It's also what Donald Trump is doing. He is ignoring the problem completely. And not addressing it. So in the Theranos video, Elizabeth Holmes was doing a little bit of this absolving thing, and he was just denying that there was a problem, and then basically ignoring that it even existed. So we're looking at Vroom and Yetton's model, and he basically has indicated several approaches to making decisions when you're the leader or the CEO of a firm. And the first is the autocratic approach. And this autocratic approach actually has 2 subtypes, and I'll show them there. The first is you just make the decision yourself. You don't even ask for information from anybody. You don't consult with anybody. The second is still autocratic because you're still making that decision, but you are actually gathering information from your subordinates. You're not actually asking for opinions. All you're doing is, give me some sales information, for example, give me some statistics about this, but you're still making that decision yourself. Now, the third approach is the consultative type, where here you're actually sharing the problem with the subordinates. You're actually asking them for their opinion about how to address this problem, but you're actually not bringing them together. So you're just approaching them individually, and they're not sort of in one room where they're actually exchanging ideas. So you're still making that decision, although now you're consulting what the opinion of these people are. Another approach is you share the problem with the group and you gather them together so that they can actually exchange ideas. Then after that exchange of ideas, you're still the one to make the decision. So you step back, get their opinion, and then you step back and make that decision yourself. Now, the fifth approach is collaborative approach, where you actually are sharing the problem with the group, and then the whole group makes a decision by sharing alternatives and opinions. Okay, so now I'm not saying that one type is better than the other. I will just tell you, depending on the situation, one approach might be better than the other. So for example, if you're in a hurry and you have to make a life or death decision, quite suddenly, then maybe the autocratic type 1 would probably be the quickest way to make a decision, and might be appropriate given the situation. Now, however, if you have a lot more time, to make that decision, and you want to make, consider all the perspectives of the problem, then you might go with the collaborative approach, which basically gets the group together. And this also assumes that the people in your group have the right skills and have the right expertise and capabilities to make informed decisions. So, but if you don't, then maybe you can't make them make the decision, especially if you feel that the decision might not be the right path. So you might approach somewhere in the middle. A consultative type 2, for example, might be a good approach for you. Okay, so let's have a look at Jeff Immelt, who was the former CEO of General Electric, and you can see from his decision-making style, he has a certain type of approach. And I quote, "I make every decision, but get lots of advice. I don't delegate." So it's, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And then boom, I make a decision. So pause the video for a moment and ask yourself, well, what approach is Jeff Immelt using? Is he more of an autocratic type, getting information from subordinates? Is he a consultative type where he consults with people? Or is he collaborative type where he actually allows the group to make a decision by themselves? So ask yourself that based on this statement.